December 21st, 1945. 11:45 a.m. A military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. Beatrice Patton sat beside a bed where her husband, General Georges Patton, lay paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days earlier, his car had collided with an army truck on a quiet road outside Mannheim. The most aggressive, most fearless general in the American army couldn't move. He could barely breathe on his own. Beatrice held his hand and listened as doctors explained that his condition was deteriorating. But something about the accident bothered her. Something didn't add up. The details changed every time someone told the story. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Evidence disappeared. And in the weeks and months after Patton died on December 21st, his family would ask questions that were never fully answered. Was it really just a tragic accident? Or was there something darker behind the death of America's most controversial general? This is a story about the suspicious circumstances surrounding Patton's death, the enemies he made in his final months, and why his own family believed something wasn't right. If you want more deep dives into the commanders who won and lost the war, hit subscribe. We're building something special here. The questions surrounding Patton's death matter because they reveal just how many powerful people wanted him silenced. In his final months, Patton had made enemies at the highest levels. He had criticized American policy toward Germany. He had demanded that America prepare to fight the Soviet Union. He had embarrassed the army with inflammatory statements to the press. Some people in Washington believed Patton was becoming a political liability. Others thought he was dangerously unstable. And Patton himself told friends he believed someone wanted him dead. When the accident happened, it seemed almost too convenient. The general who couldn't keep quiet was suddenly unable to speak at all. To understand why Patton's death raised suspicions, you need to understand who Patton had become by late 1945. This wasn't the triumphant general who had relieved Bastogne or raced across France. This was a bitter, angry man who felt betrayed by his own country. George Patton had always been different from other generals. He was born wealthy, educated at elite schools, and obsessed with military history. He believed he had lived past lives as a warrior and that war was his destiny. During World War II, he proved to be one of the most effective combat commanders America ever produced. His Third Army moved faster, fought harder, and suffered fewer casualties than any comparable unit. His soldiers adored him because he led from the front and shared their dangers. But his fellow generals often despised him because he was arrogant, crude, and made them look timid by comparison. Patton's personality worked during wartime. Eisenhower needed someone who could attack relentlessly and take risks others wouldn't. But when the war ended in May 1945, Patton's usefulness ended too. The skills that made him a brilliant combat commander made him a terrible peacetime administrator. And his opinions, always controversial, became dangerous. Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria in May 1945. It should have been a simple job. Oversee the occupation, help rebuild, implement denazification policies. Instead, Patton turned it into a disaster. He didn't believe in denazification, the Allied policy of removing former Nazis from positions of authority. Patton thought it was stupid and said so publicly. He told reporters that forcing out experienced German administrators was like removing Republicans or Democrats from office in America. He said the Nazi Party was just another political party and that most Germans who joined were no different from Americans who joined political parties at home. These statements caused outrage in Washington. Americans had just finished fighting a war that killed 400,000 of their soldiers. The concentration camps had been liberated only months earlier. Photographs of Dachau and Bergen-Belsen were still fresh in everyone's minds. And here was George Patton comparing Nazis to American political parties. Eisenhower, now Army Chief of Staff, was appalled. He had protected Patton throughout the war despite countless controversies. The slapping incidents in Sicily, the inflammatory speeches, the constant feuding with other commanders. Eisenhower had tolerated it all because Patton won battles. But the war was over now, and Patton's statements were embarrassing the entire army. Worse, Patton was making statements about the Soviet Union that violated official policy. In May 1945, as American and Soviet forces met in Germany, Patton told his staff they should keep fighting straight through Germany and into Russia. He said the Soviets were the real enemy and that America should deal with them now while the army was mobilized. He told one reporter that America would have to fight Russia eventually, so why not do it while American forces were already in Europe? These statements horrified officials in Washington. President Truman was trying to maintain the wartime alliance with Stalin. The United Nations was being formed. American foreign policy depended on Soviet cooperation. Patton's public statements undermined everything Truman was trying to accomplish. In September 1945, Patton held a press conference that ended his career. A reporter asked about his denazification policies. Patton gave a long, rambling answer that compared the Nazi Party to American political parties again. The story made headlines across America. Newspaper editorials demanded his removal. Congressmen called for investigations. Veterans groups protested. Eisenhower had no choice. On October 2, 1945, he relieved Patton of command of the Third Army and reassigned him to a meaningless paper-shuffling job overseeing military history. Patton was devastated. For the first time in his life, he had no real purpose. He was 60 years old, in poor health, and facing retirement. His wife Beatrice was back in America. He lived alone in a commandeered German mansion, drinking too much and growing increasingly bitter. He wrote letters to Beatrice saying he felt like he was being pushed out. He told friends that powerful people in Washington wanted him gone. In one letter, he wrote that he felt like he was being watched and that he believed his phone was tapped. But Patton also began planning a new career. He would retire from the army, return to America, and write his memoirs. He told friends his book would expose what he saw as failed policies toward Germany and the Soviet Union. He would tell the truth about the war, about the mistakes made by political leaders, about the threat posed by Stalin. Publishers were already interested. Patton's name would sell books, and his willingness to criticize official policy would make his memoir controversial and profitable. This plan worried people in Washington. Patton had access to classified information. He had been present at conferences where Churchill, Roosevelt, and other leaders made sensitive decisions. He knew details about Allied planning that were still secret. A bitter, angry Patton writing a tell-all memoir could damage reputations and reveal information the government wanted kept quiet. Some officials quietly suggested that Patton needed to be careful about what he published. Others thought he should be prevented from publishing at all. Into this tense situation came December 9, 1945. Patton decided to go hunting. He invited his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, to join him. They would drive into the countryside near Mannheim and hunt pheasant. It was a Sunday, and Patton needed to get out of his office and clear his head. He was scheduled to return to America in a few days, and he wanted one last chance to relax. The hunting trip was arranged at the last minute. Patton's driver, a young private named Horace Woodring, was given the assignment only that morning. The car they used was Patton's personal Cadillac, a large sedan that had been modified for his use. Gay sat in the front passenger seat. Patton and another officer sat in the back. Around noon, they were driving on a road outside Mannheim. Woodring was at the wheel, driving carefully because the roads were icy. Traffic was light. Suddenly, at an intersection, an army truck pulled out from a side road directly into their path. Woodring hit the brakes, but the Cadillac was too close. The car slammed into the truck's side. The collision wasn't severe by modern standards. The Cadillac was traveling slowly, and the impact was more of a heavy bump than a crash. Gay, sitting in the front seat, was shaken but unhurt. Woodring was fine. The officer sitting next to Patton in the back was fine. But Patton, sitting behind Gay, was thrown forward violently. His head struck something inside the car. When Gay turned around, Patton was slumped in his seat, blood running from a gash on his forehead. and he couldn't move. Gay ordered Woodring to find help immediately. An ambulance arrived within minutes and took Patton to a military hospital in Heidelberg. Doctors examined him and discovered a fracture to his cervical vertebrae. The injury had severed his spinal cord at the neck. Patton was paralyzed from the neck down and could barely breathe without assistance. The doctors were pessimistic. This type of injury was almost always fatal in 1945. For 12 days, Patton lay in that hospital bed, unable to move, struggling to breathe. Beatrice flew from America to be with him. She arrived on December 11th and sat with him every day. Patton knew he was dying. He told Beatrice he didn't want to live as a paralyzed invalid. He said he would rather die than survive as less than whole. On December 21st, he developed an embolism. His breathing became labored. At 5:50 p.m., with Beatrice holding his hand, George Patton died. The official story was simple. A tragic accident. The general had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The truck driver, an Army sergeant named Robert Thompson, said he hadn't seen the Cadillac approaching. The road was slippery, visibility was poor, and the collision happened too fast to prevent. It was ruled an accident, and the investigation was closed quickly. But Beatrice Patton didn't believe it. Neither did Patton's daughters. And over the years, as they reviewed the evidence and talked to witnesses, their suspicions grew. The first problem was the truck itself. The Army truck that hit Patton's car was traveling with 2 other vehicles. All 3 trucks were from the same motor pool. Immediately after the accident, one of the other trucks drove away without stopping. No one recorded its identification number. The truck itself was never properly examined. Military police arrived at the scene, took brief statements, and cleared the wreckage. Normal accident investigation procedures weren't followed. The second problem was Sergeant Thompson, the driver. In initial statements, he said he pulled out without seeing Patton's car. Later, he changed his story, saying he had been cut off by another vehicle and forced into Patton's path. Then he changed it again, saying he simply didn't remember what happened. Thompson was briefly detained, then released. He was never charged with any offense. And within weeks, he was transferred out of Germany and sent back to the United States, where he disappeared from public record. The third problem was the nature of Patton's injury. Doctors noted that the fracture to his cervical vertebrae was unusual for the type of collision that occurred. The impact had been relatively minor. Everyone else in the car was uninjured. Yet Patton, a large, physically tough man who had survived combat for years, suffered a catastrophic spinal injury. Some doctors who reviewed the medical reports later said the injury was more consistent with a severe blow to the head or neck than with a car accident. The fourth problem was what happened to the physical evidence. The Cadillac itself was quickly repaired and put back into service. No photographs were taken of the damage. The scene of the accident wasn't properly documented. Medical records from the hospital were incomplete. When researchers tried to investigate years later, they discovered that key documents were missing from Army files. The fifth problem, and perhaps the most suspicious, was the timing. Patton was scheduled to leave Germany on December 10th, one day after the accident. He was going home to retire, write his memoirs, and potentially become a vocal critic of American foreign policy. The accident happened on December 9th, the day before his departure. If someone wanted to prevent Patton from returning to America and speaking out, this would have been the last opportunity. Beatrice Patton spent years after her husband's death trying to get answers. She wrote letters to Army officials demanding a thorough investigation. She hired private investigators to track down witnesses. She talked to doctors who specialized in spinal injuries, trying to understand whether her husband's injury could really have resulted from such a minor accident. The answers she received were never satisfying. In private conversations with family and close friends, Beatrice said she believed her husband had been murdered. She thought the accident had been staged or that Patton had been deliberately injured. She didn't know who was responsible, but she believed it had been ordered by someone high in the government or military who wanted Patton silenced. She never publicly accused anyone, knowing she had no proof. But she never accepted the official story either. Patton's daughters felt the same way. They remembered their father's letters from his final months, his statements that he felt watched and threatened. They remembered how eager he had been to return home and tell his story. They couldn't believe that a man who had survived combat across North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany had died in a minor car accident on a quiet Sunday morning. Over the decades, various theories emerged about what really happened. Some investigators suggested that the accident had been arranged by Soviet intelligence, who saw Patton as a dangerous anti-Soviet voice. Others suggested that American intelligence services were involved, acting on orders from officials who feared what Patton might reveal in his memoirs. Still others suggested it was simply what it appeared to be, a tragic accident that happened to come at a suspicious time. The truth is we may never know. Most of the people directly involved are dead. Records that might provide answers are missing or were never created. Thompson, the truck driver, died years ago without ever giving a detailed public account of what happened. The Army closed its investigation quickly and showed no interest in reopening it despite questions from the Patton family. What we do know is that Patton had made powerful enemies by December 1945. His statements about the Soviet Union contradicted official American policy at the highest levels. His planned memoir threatened to embarrass military and political leaders. His continued presence on the public stage would have complicated American foreign policy during the early Cold War. There were people in Washington who would have been relieved by his silence, whether they actively conspired to cause it or simply welcomed it when it happened. We also know that the investigation into Patton's accident was inadequate by any standard. Evidence wasn't preserved. Witnesses weren't properly questioned. Alternative explanations weren't seriously considered. Whether this resulted from bureaucratic incompetence or deliberate cover-up is impossible to determine now. But it's clear that the Army didn't want to look too closely at what happened on that road outside Mannheim. So when Beatrice Patton sat beside her husband's hospital bed and watched him die, unable to move or speak, she had every reason to wonder if this was really an accident. The man who had been too loud, too controversial, too willing to speak uncomfortable truths was suddenly and conveniently silenced. The general who wanted to tell his story would never get the chance. That's what makes Patton's death suspicious. Not any single piece of evidence, but the accumulation of inconsistencies, unanswered questions, and convenient timing. The missing records, the changed stories, the hasty investigation. The fact that the one man who could have complicated American policy toward the Soviet Union died just before returning home to do exactly that. History is filled with convenient coincidences. Sometimes accidents happen at suspicious times without any conspiracy behind them. But history is also filled with powerful people who eliminate inconvenient voices. And in December 1945, George Patton had become very inconvenient indeed. The larger question Patton's death raises is about how democracies handle difficult truths. Patton wanted to tell the American people that their wartime ally, the Soviet Union, was actually a dangerous enemy. He wanted to criticize the denazification policies he thought were counterproductive. He wanted to challenge the official narrative about the war and its aftermath. Whether he was right or wrong about these things, he had the right to speak. But if he was silenced, either through murder or through a convenient accident that powerful people chose not to investigate too carefully, then democracy failed. We'll probably never have definitive proof either way. The Patton family's suspicions may be justified, or they may be the understandable result of grief and confusion. The missing evidence might indicate a cover-up, or it might just reflect the chaos of post-war Germany and sloppy record-keeping. Thompson's changing story might mean he was lying to hide something sinister, or it might mean he was a frightened young soldier who genuinely didn't remember the details of a traumatic event. But this much is certain: George Patton died under circumstances that his own family found suspicious. The investigation was inadequate. Questions remain unanswered 79 years later. And whether by accident, negligence, or design, the most vocal potential critic of early Cold War policy was silenced just before he could speak. After Patton's death, Beatrice did eventually publish his papers, but they were heavily edited and didn't include the controversial material he had planned for his memoir. The officers who served under Patton went on to distinguished careers, but none of them publicly questioned the official story of his death. The Army moved on, and Patton became a legend remembered for his wartime achievements rather than his controversial final months. German officers who fought against Patton later said they considered him the most dangerous Allied commander. Not Montgomery with his careful planning. Not Bradley with his steady competence. Patton, who moved too fast to predict and hit too hard to stop. They never had to face him in battle again. Neither did the Soviets, who would have faced him if Patton had gotten his way and the Cold War had turned hot in 1945. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's most controversial mysteries. If you want more stories about the decisions and personalities that shaped the war, check out our other videos on the channel. And if you haven't already, subscribe. These stories deserve to be told.